The universe has a way of reminding us how small we are. For decades, humanity reached into the cosmos with open hands, hoping to find friends among the stars. We built stations in the dark, planted flags on distant moons, and dreamed of the day we would meet others like us. We never imagined that when we finally met them, they would come not with greetings, but with fire. The research outpost orbited a quiet moon in the Kepler 442 system. 67 scientists called it home. They were there to study the strange mineral formations that covered the lunar surface, compounds that could revolutionize energy production back on Earth. Among them was Dr. Rebecca Torres, a geologist who had left behind a husband and 2 children for this opportunity. She told herself it would only be 2 years. 2 years to make a discovery that would change everything. 2 years to secure her family's future. She was in the observation deck when the sensors started screaming. The coffee in her hand trembled, ripples spreading across the surface, as if the liquid itself sensed what was coming. Through the reinforced viewport, she saw them. 7 vessels, each one a nightmare of angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. They were the color of dried blood under a dying sun, and they moved through space like sharks circling prey. Lieutenant David Okonkwo was in the communications room when the first transmission came through. He had been a soldier before becoming a station security officer, had seen combat in the resource wars back on Earth. He thought he knew what fear felt like. He was wrong. The voice that came through the speakers wasn't a voice at all. It was the sound of stars dying, of civilizations turning to dust. The translator struggled to make sense of it, but 3 words came through clear enough. Kneel, serve, survive. No introduction. No explanation. Just a command delivered with the certainty of a species that had never been told no. David's hand moved to the emergency alert, but he knew it was already too late. The nearest military vessel was 3 days away. The nearest fleet was 2 weeks out. They were alone. The lead alien ship fired without waiting for a response. The weapon didn't behave like anything in human physics textbooks. Space itself seemed to fold inward, creating a point of impossible gravity that ripped through the station's outer ring like paper. 17 people died in that first shot, their bodies scattered into the void before they could even scream. Rebecca felt the station shudder beneath her feet. Alarms wailed. Red emergency lights painted the walls the color of blood. She ran toward the evacuation pods, her mind already calculating who would make it and who wouldn't. There were 43 pods. 67 people. The math was cruel. She reached the pod bay to find chaos. People were screaming, fighting, crying. Lieutenant Okonkwo stood by the controls, his face set in grim determination. He was manually launching pods, sending them out in random directions at random intervals. Some would make it, most wouldn't. But random was better than organized. Random meant the aliens would have to work to kill them all. "Get in," he shouted at Rebecca, pointing to an empty pod. She shook her head. There are others who need it more. A young intern named Tommy Chun pushed past her, his eyes wide with terror. He was 19 years old. He had only arrived 3 weeks ago. David shoved him into the pod and sealed the hatch. "Go!" The pod shot away into the black. Another followed. Then another. The aliens were firing on them now, targeting the small escape vehicles like a child crushing ants. Some exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Others simply stopped transmitting. But a few, maybe 6 or 7, disappeared into the dark at angles the aliens didn't anticipate. Rebecca made it to a pod. So did David. They launched together, their small vehicles racing away from the dying station. Behind them, the research outpost that had been home to 67 souls collapsed in on itself. The alien weapons didn't just destroy. They erased. Where the station had been, there was now only twisted metal and frozen bodies tumbling through space. Rebecca's pod tumbled through the void, its emergency beacon screaming into the silence. She watched through the tiny viewport as the alien ships regrouped. They hung in space like predators, satisfied with their kill, their hulls reflecting no light, as if they absorbed illumination itself. Then, slowly, they turned and moved deeper into human territory. They were heading toward the colony worlds. 3 days later, Rebecca's pod was recovered by the UN's Defiance, a destroyer that had burned its engines to maximum just to reach the distress signals. The captain, a weathered woman named Patricia Wu, personally opened the pod hatch. She found Rebecca curled in the fetal position, her eyes red from crying, her hands still shaking. "How many?" Patricia asked quietly. 11, Rebecca whispered. 11 made it out. I watched the others die. Patricia helped her to the medical bay, but her mind was already racing. 11 survivors out of 67. And this was just one attack. Reports were flooding in from across the frontier. The aliens had hit 4 more outposts, 2 mining colonies, and a civilian transport. The death toll was approaching 2,000. And the attacks had only started 5 days ago, in the Emergency Command Center on Luna. General Thomas Blackwood stood before a holographic display showing every attack site. His staff moved around him like ghosts, their faces hollow with exhaustion and horror. Communications Officer Jennifer Park stepped up beside him, her tablet glowing with incoming data. "Sir, we've identified the aggressors." The xenolinguistics team traced their language patterns. They call themselves the Carthene Dominion. They've been expanding through this sector of space for at least 3 centuries. Conquering? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Enslaving, Jennifer corrected. According to the fragments we've decoded, they've subjugated 43 different species. They have a standard protocol. They arrive, demonstrate overwhelming force, offer terms of submission. Any species that resists is destroyed. Any species that submits becomes part of their labor force. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. They think we're just another primitive species. They think we'll roll over like all the others. Jennifer nodded. Their entire strategy is based on shock and awe. Hit hard, hit fast, make resistance seem impossible. It's worked for them for centuries. Thomas turned to look at her. His eyes were hard as stone. It won't work on us. Within hours, the United Nations Space Command issued a declaration that would echo through history. There would be no negotiation. There would be no submission. Humanity would fight with everything it had, and if the fight couldn't be won, humanity would make the cost of victory so high that the Carthene would regret ever hearing the name of Earth. Every military vessel in the solar system received mobilization orders. Every shipyard shifted to war production. Every scientist, every engineer, every person who could contribute to the war effort was called to service. This wasn't a police action. This wasn't a border dispute. This was total war, and humanity would fight it the only way it knew how. With everything the Carthene had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that humans were like every other species they had encountered. They had assumed that overwhelming force would break the human spirit. They didn't understand that humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years. They didn't understand that humanity had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times over and always came back stronger. They didn't understand that when you back a human into a corner, when you give them no choice but fight or die, they will tear through walls with their bare hands to reach you. The aliens had killed 2,000 people. They had destroyed 6 outposts. They had delivered their ultimatum. Now they were going to learn what happens when you threaten humanity's children. They were going to learn that humans don't forgive. And they never, ever forget. The Carthene fleet returned to their staging ground beyond the Oort cloud, confident in their superiority. Fleet Marshal Vesketh stood in the command chamber of his flagship, watching holographic projections of the attacks. By their standards, it had been a perfect operation. Swift, brutal, efficient. He expected surrender within days. Lieutenant Krull approached, his secondary arms folded in a gesture of confusion. "Marshal, we are receiving no communication from the human government. No plea for mercy. No offer of terms." Vesketh made a clicking sound that passed for laughter among his kind. "They are primitive. Perhaps they do not yet understand what has happened. Give them time to count their dead. Fear will come, but fear did not come. Instead, 3 weeks. After the attacks, Carthene reconnaissance drones began disappearing. Not destroyed, simply gone. Vanished without a trace or distress signal. Vesketh found this mildly curious, but not concerning. Drones malfunctioned. It happened. Then the listening post at the edge of human space went silent. Vesketh sent a patrol to investigate. The patrol found wreckage. The listening post had been obliterated by kinetic weapons, primitive magnetic accelerators that had torn through the station's shields like they weren't there. Among the debris, they found a message burned into a piece of hull plating in crude Carthene script. "You wanted war. Now you have it." For the first time in his long career, Vesketh felt something he didn't recognize. It would be many weeks before he understood it was doubt. On Earth, the transformation was total. Dr. Nathan Cross stood in what had once been the particle physics laboratory at CERN. Now it was a weapons development facility. Sleep was a luxury. Food was fuel. Every mind, every resource, every ounce of human ingenuity was focused on a single question: how do we kill them? "The problem is their shields," Nathan explained to the assembled team of physicists and military engineers. "They use some kind of multi-layered energy field. Our missiles just splash against it. Our lasers disperse. Even our railgun rounds lose 90% of their kinetic energy before impact." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a brilliant quantum physicist who had been studying peaceful applications of her work just a month ago, stepped forward. "What if we don't try to break through the shield? What if we make the shield break itself?" The room went quiet. "Explain," Nathan said. "YUK. I pulled up equations on the holographic display. Their shields work by detecting incoming threats and forming a barrier of opposing force. The bigger the threat, the more energy they pour into the shield. So what if we hit them with something that makes them overload their own defenses?" "A feedback loop," Nathan breathed. "We hit them with a massive energy spike. Their shields amplify in response, and the amplification creates a cascade that burns out their generators." "Exactly. We need to build a weapon that's specifically designed not to penetrate, but to be absorbed. A resonance bomb." Within 6 days, they had a prototype. Within 12 days, they had armed every human warship with the new weapon. But weapons alone wouldn't win this war. They needed tactics, strategy, and something the Carthene had never encountered before: unpredictability. Commander Helena Ramirez stood before the assembled captains of Earth's defense fleet. She was young for a commander, only 34, but she had earned her rank in the resource wars, where she had led a squadron to victory against impossible odds. Her specialty was asymmetric warfare, fighting enemies who were bigger, stronger, and better equipped. "Everything we know about the Carthene tells us they're used to conventional warfare," she said, her voice carrying through the briefing room. "They line up their ships, they fire their weapons, they rely on superior firepower to overwhelm their opponents. Every species they've conquered has fought them the same way, ship to ship, formation to formation." Captain James Sterling, commander of the destroyer Relentless, leaned forward. "And we're not going to do that," Helena smiled. It was not a kind smile. We're going to fight dirty. Ambushes. Hit and run attacks. We'll use asteroids for cover. We'll hide ships powered down in debris fields. We'll make them paranoid, make them scared, make them second-guess every sensor reading. And when they finally commit their full fleet, when they're angry enough to make mistakes, that's when we hit them with everything we have. The plan was approved. Over the next 2 months, human forces engaged in a campaign of guerrilla warfare that the Carthene had no context for. Small ships would appear, strike, and vanish before the Carthene could respond. Mines were seeded throughout space routes. Decoy signals led entire battle groups into traps. The Carthene lost ships not to glorious battle, but to paranoia and exhaustion. Aboard a refitted cargo hauler called the Persistence, engineer Michael O'Brien and his crew were putting the final touches on their weapon. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. It was 100 nuclear warheads strapped to engines with a targeting computer and a prayer. "You realize this is insane," said his second, a woman named Rachel Kim, who had been a civilian shuttle pilot 4 months ago. "Completely insane," Michael agreed. "But if it works, we take out one of their capital ships. How many lives is that worth?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. She thought about her brother, who had been on the research station in the Kepler system, who had died in the first attack. "All of them," she said finally. "It's worth all of them." The Carthene fleet was moving toward Mars, intent on demonstrating what happened to species that resisted. Fleet Marshal Viscoth had assembled 40 warships, a force capable of sterilizing a planet. He would make an example of the human homeworld. He would show the galaxy what defiance cost. His fleet moved in perfect formation, shields linked, sensors, sweeping space for any sign of the irritating human raiders who had been harassing his forces. They detected the Persistence when it was still 1,000,000 kilometers away. A single cargo ship, ancient and slow, limping toward them with failing engines. A refugee vessel, Krell reported, attempting to escape the battle zone. "Destroy it," Vesketh ordered without interest. "Leave no survivors." But as the weapons charged, someone on the bridge noticed something. The cargo ship's engines weren't failing. They were accelerating, and the ship was heading directly for the flagship. Evasive maneuvers. Vescoth roared, but capital ships are not nimble. The Persistence crashed into the Carthene flagship's shield at relativistic speed. The impact alone would have been devastating, but Michael O'Brien had timed it perfectly. The moment before impact, every nuclear warhead detonated simultaneously. The resonance bombs that Dr. Tanaka had developed were already attached to the fleet's hull, planted by stealth teams weeks earlier. The nuclear blast triggered them. The Carthene shields tried to absorb the energy, amplified it, and created a feedback loop that tore through the entire fleet's linked defensive network. 40 ships, gone in a flash of light brighter than the sun. Michael O'Brien never knew if his sacrifice worked. The blast vaporized the Persistence instantly. But Rachel Kim, watching from a hidden observation post on Phobos, saw the Carthene fleet die. She saw the plan work. She recorded every second of it and transmitted it back to Earth. The message was simple. They can bleed, we can win. Across human space, the recording played on every screen, every monitor, every display. People who had been terrified saw hope. Soldiers who had been fighting a losing battle saw victory. Scientists who had been desperately searching for solutions saw proof that their weapons worked. Vesketh survived. His escape pod was recovered by a patrol vessel. As he watched the replay of his fleet's destruction, he finally understood what that feeling had been. Not doubt, terror. These humans weren't fighting like any species he had encountered. They were willing to sacrifice everything. They turned their own ships into weapons. They fought with a ferocity that made no tactical sense. He sent a message back to the Carthene High Command. Recommend full withdrawal. These humans are not like other species. They do not value their own lives over victory. They cannot be intimidated. They cannot be broken. The High Command's response was immediate and absolute. Unacceptable. Assemble the Grand Fleet. We will crush them with numbers they cannot match. We will show the galaxy what happens to species that resist the Dominion. Veskith read the orders and felt his scales prickle with dread. The High Command didn't understand. They were sending more ships, more forces, more firepower. But you cannot defeat an enemy who has already decided they would rather die than submit. You cannot frighten people who have turned fear into fuel. The humans had been preparing for this war for 2 months. The Carthene had been preparing to conquer for 3 centuries. But in those 2 months, humanity had done what it did best. It had adapted, innovated, and weaponized its own desperation. The real war was about to begin, and the Carthene were going to learn a lesson that 43 conquered species had never taught them. Some prey fights back. The Grand Fleet of the Carthene Dominion was a sight that had broken the spirit of civilizations. 300 warships, each one a monument to conquest, assembled at the edge of the solar system. They came with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. Fleet Marshal Veskith watched them arrive and felt no relief, only the growing certainty that they were all making a terrible mistake. On Earth, in the command center buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, General Thomas Blackwood stood before a holographic display showing the approaching armada. Around him, men and women from every nation worked in silent coordination. The old borders meant nothing now. The old grudges were forgotten. There was only humanity, and there was only survival. 300 ships, Commander Helena Ramirez said quietly. We have 78 combat-ready vessels. Thomas nodded slowly. The math was brutal. Even with their new weapons, even with their tactics, the numbers were overwhelming. But he had learned something in his 40 years of military service. Numbers weren't everything. How many of their ships can we kill before they reach Earth? Helena smiled that fierce smile of hers. All of them, sir. Or we die trying. The battle plan was simple because it had to be. Complexity failed under pressure. They would divide their forces into 3 groups. The first would hit the Carthene flanks, drawing them into pursuit. The second would attack their supply lines, forcing them to split their fleet. The third would wait, hidden among the asteroid belt, and strike when the enemy was divided and confused. Dr. Nathan Cross had given them one more gift. Working without sleep for 72 hours straight, his team had developed something they called the Hellfire missile. It was inelegant, brutal, and terrifying. The missile carried a miniature fusion reactor that would go critical on impact, creating an explosion that could tear through even Carthene armor. Each one was a one-shot weapon. Each one cost as much as a small spacecraft. They had built 800 of them. Across the solar system, families gathered in shelters. Children held their parents' hands. People prayed to gods they had forgotten. Everyone knew what was coming. If the fleet failed, if Earth's defenders fell, there would be no second chance. The Carthene would erase humanity from existence as a warning to other species, who might think about resistance. In orbit around Mars, Captain James Sterling stood on the bridge of the Relentless. His crew of 97 souls moved through their pre-battle routines with practiced efficiency. They were terrified. They were determined. They were human. All ships report ready, Captain. His first officer reported. James looked at the faces around him. Young and old. Veterans and rookies. People who had been strangers 6 months ago and were now family. Open a channel. All ships. The communication officer nodded. Every vessel in the human fleet could now hear him. I'm not going to lie to you, James said, his voice steady. The odds are against us. The enemy is stronger, more advanced, more numerous. By every logical calculation, we should lose this fight. But logic doesn't account for something the Cartheen have never faced. It doesn't account for humans who fight not because they think they can win, but because surrender is worse than death. Our ancestors climbed down from the trees with nothing but rocks and sticks. They faced predators with claws and fangs. They shouldn't have survived. But they did, because they refused to give up, because they turned their fear into fury. We are their children. We carry that same fire. Today, we show the galaxy what humans do when you threaten our home. Today, we teach the Cartheen that humanity doesn't break. We burn. Across the fleet, in 78 ships, people gripped their stations and felt something shift inside them. Fear was still there, but it was fuel now, not paralysis. The Cartheen Grand Fleet entered the asteroid belt in perfect formation. Vesketh watched his sensors, waiting for the ambush he knew was coming. He had warned the High Command. He had told them these humans fought differently. They had ignored him. The first wave hit from above and below simultaneously. 20 human destroyers appeared from behind asteroids, their new weapons blazing. Hellfire missiles streaked across the void. Where they hit, Cartheen ships died. Not disabled, not damaged, dead. The fusion explosions tore through shields, through armor, through everything. The Grand Fleet responded as they always did. They turned to face the threat, brought their superior firepower to bear. Half their number pursued the human ships, which immediately scattered and ran. The formation broke. Exactly as Helena had planned. Engineer Rachel Kim commanded a squadron of small, fast attack craft. They were built from gutted freighters, with oversized engines and minimal life support. They weren't meant to survive. They were meant to kill. Her group struck the Cartheen supply ships, the massive vessels that carried fuel and ammunition for the fleet. 3 supply ships exploded in the first minute. The chain reaction took out 7 more warships that were too close. The Cartheen fleet was in chaos now. They were used to enemies that stood and fought. These humans appeared, struck, and vanished. They used the asteroids like a 3-dimensional maze. Every rock could hide a ship. Every shadow could conceal death. Then came the third wave. Commander Helena Ramirez had hidden 30 ships in a debris field that the Cartheen sensors had dismissed as worthless. They had been powered down, silent, waiting. Now they activated everything at once. Engines roared. Weapons charged. And they fell on the divided Cartheen fleet like wolves on scattered sheep. The battle was chaos. Beautiful, terrible chaos. Human ships fought with a desperation that made them unpredictable. When their weapons ran dry, they rammed. When their ships were crippled, they set reactors to overload and aimed themselves at Cartheen vessels. Every human ship that died took at least 1 Cartheen ship with them. Often more. Dr. Yuki Tanaka watched the battle from the safety of the Lunar Command Center and wept. Not from sadness, from pride. Her weapons were working. Her people were winning. The cost was horrific, but they were winning. Fleet Marshal Vesketh saw his Grand Fleet dying and finally understood. The humans weren't trying to defeat them with superior tactics or technology. They were teaching the Cartheen a lesson in cost. Every Cartheen ship destroyed was irreplaceable. Every human ship that fell was immediately mourned, but also immediately counted as worth it. The humans had decided that trading their lives for Cartheen lives was acceptable. More than acceptable. It was victory. When Captain James Sterling's ship took a direct hit that ripped through the engine room, killing 40 of his crew, he didn't retreat. He aimed the dying Relentless at the nearest Cartheen battleship and pushed the engines to maximum. His navigator looked at him with wide eyes. "Sir, we'll never survive the impact." James smiled. It was the saddest smile in the universe. I know, but they won't either. And that's enough. The Relentless crashed into the Carthene battleship at a speed that turned both vessels into expanding clouds of plasma. 97 human souls died. 3,000 Carthene died. James Sterling's last thought was of his daughter back on Earth. He hoped she would grow up in a universe that remembered this day. The battle raged for 7 hours. When it ended, 263 Carthene ships were destroyed or crippled beyond repair. 37 limped away into deep space, running from an enemy they finally feared. Of the 78 human ships that had entered the battle, 9 survived. But they had done the impossible. They had broken the Grand Fleet. They had shown the galaxy that humanity could not be conquered. Veskath's escape pod was recovered again, this time by a human patrol. They brought him aboard, treated his wounds, and gave him water. He stared at his captors in confusion. Why? He asked through the translator. Why not kill me? General Thomas Blackwood came to see him personally. The old general looked tired, looked ancient, looked like he had aged a century in a single day. But his eyes were hard as diamonds. Because you're going to go back to your people, Thomas said quietly. You're going to tell them what happened here. You're going to tell them that humanity will never submit, never surrender. And if they ever come to our space again, we will kill them all. Every single one. Even if it costs us everything. Veskath was released with a message for the Carthene High Command. The message was simple. It was also final. Stay away from Earth. Across the galaxy, other species watched and wondered. The Carthene Dominion, undefeated for 3 centuries, had been shattered by primitives. The Grand Fleet was gone. The mighty Carthene had run from battle. The battle for Earth was over. The Carthene Grand Fleet, once a symbol of galactic dominance, was now nothing more than cosmic dust and twisted metal, a silent graveyard orbiting our scarred blue planet. The invaders had come with overwhelming force, confident in their technological superiority, expecting another swift and easy conquest, just like the 43 civilizations they had crushed before. They had calculated everything, from our ship capabilities to our planetary defenses. They believed they knew us. They were wrong. Terribly wrong. On paper, humanity should have been annihilated. Our technology was primitive by their standards. Our fleet a fraction of the size of theirs. The Carthene had conquered star systems, shattered moons, and bent entire species to their will. They were the undisputed masters of their corner of the galaxy, and we were just the next name on their long list of defeated peoples. Their initial assault was brutal and devastating. They shattered our outer defenses, punched through our orbital stations, and rained fire upon our cities. The losses were catastrophic, but they made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed we would break. They assumed we would surrender, just like all the others. But the Carthene had never met a species like us. They had learned how to conquer, how to intimidate, and how to rule. But in their long history of galactic tyranny, they had never learned a crucial lesson, a lesson that was about to be seared into their collective memory. Some prey doesn't just roll over and submit. Some prey fights back with a ferocity that defies all logic. Some prey would rather burn the entire world down, themselves included, than ever kneel before a conqueror. And they had just discovered that humans were the most dangerous prey in the entire universe. Why? Because for our entire existence, for millennia upon millennia, we had been honing a very specific, very terrible skill. We had been fighting each other. We fought over land, over resources, over beliefs, over pride. We had turned war into both a science and an art form. We mastered strategy, deception, and attrition. We learned to innovate under pressure, to turn desperation into a weapon. We knew what it meant to face an existential threat, because we had been that threat to each other time and time again. And now, for the first time in our history, all of that savage, brilliant, and terrifying knowledge was turned outward, focused on a single, common enemy. The Carthene didn't just awaken a sleeping giant. They unleashed a caged demon. The cost of this revelation was staggering, almost unthinkable. 69 human ships, the pride of our fledgling star navy, were reduced to atoms. Thousands of our best and bravest, souls from every nation on Earth, gave their lives in the cold vacuum of space. The grief was a physical weight, a wound that would take generations to heal. But beneath the sorrow, a new feeling was taking root. A fierce, unyielding pride, because Earth was safe. Mars was safe. Every colony, every outpost, every single human life in the Sol system was secure. Humanity had faced the abyss and had not blinked. We had survived. And in the silent aftermath, amidst the floating wreckage of the once mighty Grand Fleet, a single message began to broadcast on an endless loop. It was a ghost in the machine, a final testament echoing through the debris field. The voice was that of Captain Eva Sterling, recorded just moments before she piloted her crippled flagship, the Indomitable, on a final suicidal charge straight into the heart of the Carthene command vessel. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with an icy resolve that chilled the void itself. It was a promise, a warning, and a declaration of who we were. We are human, her voice echoed across the stars. We do not forget, we do not forgive, and we never, ever stop fighting. That message spread. It was picked up by listening posts and wandering merchants. It traveled through hyperspace relays and was decoded on 1,000 different worlds. It became a legend, a whispered tale told in the dark corners of cantinas and the high courts of alien empires. The story of the upstart species from the Sol system that had done the impossible. The species that had not only stood against the Carthene, but had utterly broken them. The Carthene never came back. They limped back to their home world, a shattered remnant of their former glory, their empire crumbling in the wake of their stunning defeat. And more importantly, no one else came either. No other would-be conquerors, no opportunistic raiders looking for an easy prize. The word was out. The little blue-green world in that unremarkable yellow star system was off limits. That day, humanity earned something far more valuable than mere survival. We earned respect. The galaxy, in its vast and ancient wisdom, had finally learned a fundamental truth about us. We weren't just another species to be catalogued or conquered. We were not prey. Humanity was the raging storm you prayed you would never wake. The hurricane that sleeps in the calm sea. And once awakened, that storm would consume everything and everyone in its path. The universe had been put on notice. Leave humanity alone, or face the consequences, because we never, ever stop fighting. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the epic tales of science fiction. Let us know in the comments what you think about humanity's first contact going this way. Until next time, stay curious.